friends. Welcome to another episode of Machine Learning Experts. I'm your host, Brittany Muller, and today's expert is none other than Sasha Luccioni. Sasha is a research scientist here at Hugging Face, where she works on projects that are at the intersection of environmental impact and AI. You'll hear Sasha talk about how she's measured the carbon footprint of an email, how she helped a local soup kitchen leverage the power of machine learning, and just how meaning and creativity fuel her work. If you're interested in learning how machine learning experts like Sasha can help you accelerate your machine learning roadmap, please visit hf.co/support to learn more. Super excited to share this episode with all of you. Sasha is so passionate and so insightful on these topics that I know you'll get a lot out of it. So here is my conversation with Sasha Luccioni. Thank you so much for joining us today. We are so excited to have you on.
I'm really excited to be here.
So diving right in, curious if you could speak a little bit to your background. I know you have a really interesting journey that brought you to Hugging Face.
Yeah, actually, if we go all the way back, I actually started studying in linguistics. I was super into languages, and I'm like, actually, both my parents are mathematicians, so I was like, I don't want to do math, I want to do language. And then I started drifting. I started doing NLP, so natural language processing, during my undergrad. I got super into it, and then I slowly but surely started and my PhD was in computer science, but still with the linguistic angle, I guess. So I was always kind of I started out really in the humanities, and then got into computer science. And then after my PhD, I spent a couple of years working in applied AI research. So my last job was in finance, and then one day I decided that I wanted to do kind of good and socially positive AI research. So I quit my job. I decided that, no amount of money was worth working on just, kind of AI for AI's sake. I wanted to do more. And so I spent a couple of years working with Yashua Bengio at Mila, working on AI for good projects, AI for climate change projects. And then I was looking for my next role, and I wanted to be in a place that I trusted was doing the right things and going in the right direction. So Hugging Face, when I met Tom and I met Clem, I knew that it was the place for me, and that it would be exactly what I was looking for.
I love that. And I think you strike such an chord with, you wanted to do something that felt meaningful. And I feel like that's something we don't talk about enough, and it is a driving force, kind of baked into our DNA, I feel.
Yeah, when I hear people Sunday evening being Monday's tomorrow, I'm like, Monday, tomorrow's Monday, that's great. And it's not that I'm a workaholic, I definitely do other stuff, I have a family and everything, but I'm literally excited to go to work and to do really cool stuff. So I think that's important. I know people can live without it, but I can't.
Yeah, so important. What are you most excited that you're working on now?
I think the Big Science project is definitely super inspiring. For the last couple of years, I've been seeing these large language models, and I was always but how do they work, and where's their code, and where's their data, and what's going on in there, and how are they developed, and who was involved? And it was all such kind of a black box thing. And I'm so happy that we're finally making it a glass box, and there's so many people involved, and so many really interesting perspectives. And so I'm chairing the carbon footprint working group. So we're working on, even different aspects of environmental impacts, and above and beyond just counting the CO2 emissions, but other things the manufacturing costs. And even at some point we're well, how much CO2 does an email generate? Things like that. So we're definitely thinking of different perspectives, and also about the data. I'm involved in a lot of the data working groups at Big Science, and it's really interesting because typically it's been well, we're going to get the most data we can, stuff it in a language model, and it's going to be great, and it's going to learn all this stuff. But what's actually in there, there's so much kind of weird stuff on the internet, especially, and things that you don't necessarily want your model to be seeing. So we're really looking into mindful data curation and multilingualism as well, to make sure that it's not just 100% English or 99% English. So it's such a like great initiative, and it makes me excited to be involved.
That is so exciting. I love the trying to evaluate the carbon footprint of an email or the emissions of an.
Yeah, people did it, like depending on the attachment or not, and blah blah blah. But it was just like, because we found this article of, I think it was like a theoretical physics project, and they did that. They did like everything: video calls, travel, commute, emails, like the actual like experiments as well. And they made this pie chart, and it was really cool because there was like, I don't know, 37 categories in the pie chart, and we were like, we want to do that. But I don't know if we want to go into that level of detail. But we were going to ask, do a survey and ask participants, like, in average, how many hours did you spend working on big science or like training in language models and things like that. So we didn't want like a complementary, not just like the number of GPU hours for training the model, but also like people's implication and participation in the project.
That is so interesting. Could you speak a little bit more to the environmental impact of AI and what?
Yeah, it's a topic I got involved in a couple of years ago, 3 years ago now. The first article that came out was by Emma Trubel and her colleagues, and they essentially trained a large language model with hyperparameter tuning, so like essentially looking at all the different configurations. And then the figure they got was like that training that AI model emitted as much carbon as 5 cars in their lifetimes, like including gas, including everything, like the average kind of consumption. And with my colleagues at Mila, we were like, well, that doesn't sound right. Like, it can't be all models, right? And so we really went off the deep end into like figuring out what has an impact on emissions, how can we measure emissions. So first we just created this online calculator where someone could enter what hardware they used, how long they trained for, and where, like on what, essentially either a location or a cloud computing instance, and then it would give them an estimate of the carbon involved that they emitted. Essentially, that was like our first attempt. It's like a calculator. And then we helped create a package called Code Carbon, which actually does that in real time. So it's going to like run in parallel to whatever you're doing, training a model, and then at the end spit out an estimate of the carbon emissions. And lately we've been going kind of further and further. I just had an article that I was a co-author on that got accepted, that's about like how to proactively reduce emissions. So is there like, for example, by anticipating, times when servers are not as used as other times. So like, kind of doing either time delaying or, for example, picking the right region, because if you train, for example, in, I don't know, Australia, it's going to be a coal-based grid, and so it's going to be highly polluting, whereas in Quebec, in Montreal, where I'm based, it's 100% hydroelectricity. So just by making that choice, you can reduce your emissions by like 100-fold, right? And so just like small things like that, like above and beyond estimating, we also want people to start kind of reducing their emissions. It's like the next step.
That is so fascinating. That had never crossed my mind of where you're doing the actual computing.
Oh yeah, of course. Energy grids are like this. Oh, I'm so into energy grids now. I'm like, every time I go to somewhere, I'm like, so what's the energy coming from? Like, how are you generating it? Like, and so it's really interesting. Like, it's like there's a lot of historical factors. There's a lot of cultural factors. Like France is going to be nuclear, mostly energy. Canada has a lot of hydroelectric energy. Some places have like a lot of wind or tidal. And so it's really interesting just to kind of understand, when you turn on, like if you turn on a lamp, where that electricity is coming from, and like at what cost to the environment, essentially. Because, when I was growing up, it was always like, turn off the lights, unplug, whatever. But not anything more than that. It was just like good best practices, right? Like you turn off the light when you're not in a room, but after that, you can really go deeper into like, depending on where you live, your energy is coming from different sources, and they're more or less polluting and blah, blah, blah. Like we just don't see that, right? We don't see how energy is produced. We just see the light and we're like, oh, this is my lamp, right? So it's really important to kind of start thinking about that.
It's so easy not to think about that, which I could see being a major barrier for even machine learning engineers that might not have that general awareness.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, usually it's just by habit, right? I think there's like a default option when you're using cloud instances. Often it's like, well, the closest one to you, or the one with the most GPUs available, or whatever. Like there's a default thing, and people are like, okay, fine, whatever, right? Like click the default. It's like this nudge theory aspect. I did a master's in cognitive science, and we studied like just by changing the default option, you can change people's behavior to an incredible degree. Like small stuff like whether you put apples or chocolate bars near the cash register, or like some small stuff like that. And so if the default option all of a sudden was like the low carbon one, we could save so many emissions, just because people are just like, oh yeah, okay, fine, I'm going to train a model in Montreal. Like, I don't care, right? Like, it doesn't really matter as long as you have access to the hardware you need. You don't really care where it is. But in the long run, it really adds up.
Wow. What are some of the ways that machine learning teams and engineers could be a bit more proactive in aspects like that?
So I think that I've noticed a little bit that there's a certain disconnect between, like, a lot of people are really environmentally conscious, like, they'll I don't know, bike to work, or they'll eat less meat and things like that. Like, they'll have this kind of environmental awareness, but then disassociate it from their work, because we're not really aware of our impact as machine learning researchers or engineers on the environment. And so starting to measure, just without sharing it necessarily, just starting to measure, for example, carbon emissions, starting to look at what instances you're picking, if you have a choice to try to see, because, like, for example, I know that Google Cloud and AWS has started putting like low carbon as a little like tag. So you can pick it, like, it's there, the information is there, right? And starting to make these little steps. And I think that connecting the dots between environment and tech, essentially, that's a dot that these are dots that are not often connected, because tech is so like cloud. It's like it's distributed, right? You don't really see it. And so but by connecting it, by grounding it more, you see like the impact it can have on the environment.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And I've listened to a couple talks and podcasts of yours, and you've also talked about how machine learning can then be used to
we wrote a paper a couple of years ago that was really cool experience. So it's like almost 100 pages. It's called Tackling Climate Change with Machine Learning, and there were like 25 authors, but there's all these different sections, like ranging from electricity to city planning to I don't know, transportation to forestry and agriculture. Like, we essentially have these chapters of the paper where we talk about the kind of the problems that exist. For example, renewable energy. It's variable in a lot of cases. So, for example, if you have solar panels, they won't produce energy at night, right? That's kind of like a given. And then, so for example, wind power is dependent on the wind. And so typically a big challenge in implementing renewable energy is that you have to respond to the demand, right? You need to be able to give people power at night, even if you're on solar energy. And so typically you have like either diesel generators, or you have like this backup system that often like cancels out the environmental effect, like the emissions that you're saving. But what machine learning can do, you can do predictive, like essentially you're predicting how much energy will be needed. So based on like previous days, based on the temperature, based on, I don't know, even like events that happen, you can start being like, okay, well, we're going to be predicting half an hour out, or an hour out, or 6 hours, or 24 hours. And you can start having different horizons and doing time series prediction. And then instead of powering up a diesel generator, because diesel generators are cool because you can just like power them up, and then like in a couple of seconds they're up and running. What you can also do is have batteries, and then but batteries, you need to start charging them ahead of time. So say you're 6 hours out, you start charging your batteries, knowing that either there's a cloud coming or that night's going to fall. So you need that energy stored ahead, right? And so there's things that you could do that are really like proactive, that can make a huge difference. And then machine learning is really good at that. It's good at predicting the future. It's good at finding the right features and things like that. So that's like one of the go-to examples. Another one is like remote sensing. So we have a lot of satellite data about the planet, and seeing either deforestation or also like tracking wildfires. In a lot of cases, you can like detect wildfires automatically based on satellite imagery, and like deploy people right away, because like they're often in remote places that you don't necessarily have people living in. And so like there's all these different cases in which machine learning could be like super useful. We have the data, we have like the need. And so this paper is all about like how to get involved and how to essentially whatever you're good at, whatever you like doing using machine learning, how to apply that and use it in the fight against climate change.
Wow, that is so fascinating. one thing that, maybe this is a silly question, but so for people listening that are interested in this effort, but perhaps work at an organization where it's not prioritized, I'm just thinking again, like that disconnect is so easy to have with the environmental impact of AI. Are there like any tips or tricks you've picked up along the way of incentivizing teams or engineers to prioritize
So I think
that a
that it's
bit better?
also it's always a question of kind of cost and benefit or time, the time that you need to put in, and sometimes people just don't know that there are different either tools that exist or like approaches. And so if people are really kind of interested or even curious, learning about it, and I think that's really the first step, because even me, when I first started thinking of like what can I do, I didn't know. I didn't know that all these things existed. People have been working on this for like a fairly long time, in like using different data science techniques in finding things. So just like starting to read about it. Like for example, we created a website, climatechange.ai, and we have like interactive summaries that you can read, and they're like literally like 3 sentences about how climate change can help detect methane or whatever, right? And you can read about it. And I think that just by like sprinkling this knowledge can help already like trigger some interesting thought processes or discussions. Like I've participated in several like roundtables at companies who are not traditionally like climate change oriented, but who are starting to think about it. And they're like, okay, well, we started, I don't know, we put a composting bin in the kitchen. We did this and we did that. So, and then from the tech side, what can we do, right? And then it's really interesting because it's like there's a lot of low hanging fruit that you just need to learn about, and then it's like, oh well, I can do that. I can by default use this cloud computing instance, and that's not going to cost me anything, and it's just you need to change a parameter somewhere essentially.
Yeah, I feel like those are key. That's so interesting. What are some of the more common mistakes you see machine learning engineers or teams make when it comes to implementation of some of these improvements or just environmental
Something that I've
impact
seen a
in
lot,
general?
I mean, actually apparently machine learning people have, or like AI people in general have this stereotype, like from other communities, that we think AI is going to solve everything. We just arrive and we're like, oh, we're going to do AI, and it's going to solve all your problems no matter what you guys have been doing for 50 years. Like AI is going to do it. And I haven't seen that really. I haven't seen that attitude that much. But it's true that we tend to have our, because like we know what AI can do, we know what machine learning can do, and we have a certain kind of, it's like a world view. And so like when we see, it's like when you have a hammer, everything's a nail. So it's kind of something like that. Like I've participated in a couple of like hackathons and kind of just like general like people who want to make stuff or do stuff to fight climate change. And it's often like, oh, this sounds like a great thing AI can do, we're going to do it, without thinking of like how it's going to be used or how it's going to be useful or how it's going to be, right? Like, because it's like, yeah, sure, AI can do all this stuff, but then at the end of the day, someone's going to use it, or it's going to have to, like, for example, if you create for example, something for scanning satellite imagery and detecting wildfires, for example, the example I gave, well, the information that your model outputs has to be interpretable, or for example, you need to add that little extra step of like sending an email or whatever it is, right? Because otherwise it's like, we train a model, it's great, it's super accurate, blah blah blah, but then at the end of the day, nobody's going to use it just because it's missing like a tiny little connection to the real world, or to like the way that people will use this. And so that's often been, and that's like not sexy. People are like, yeah, whatever. Like I don't even know how to write a script that sends an email. I don't either, right? But still, just like doing that little extra step that's like so much less technologically complex than what you've done so far. Just like adding that little thing will make a big difference. And it can be in terms of UI, it can be in terms of like creating an app, it can be in terms of like, it's like the non-machine learning stuff that's actually really crucial for your project to be used. And I've participated in organizing workshops where people like submit ideas that like are super great on paper, that have great like accuracy rates, but then they just kind of stagnate in paper form, which is, or whatever, article form, because you still need to have that next step of like I remember this one presentation of a machine learning algorithm that could reduce flight emissions, like by airplanes, by like something like 3 to 7% by calculating the wind speed and the blah blah blah. And then, like, of course, that person should have done a startup, like, or a product, or pitched this to Boeing or whatever. But otherwise, it was just a paper that they published in this workshop that I was organizing, and then that was it. And of course, scientists or engineers don't necessarily have those skills necessary to go see an airplane manufacturer with this thing. But it's really frustrating at the end of the day to see these great ideas, this great tech that just kind of fizzles.
This is so sad. Oh my goodness. That's such a great story though. And how, there's opportunities like that just
and it can also be like, I think scientists often don't necessarily want to make money. They just want to solve problems often. And so you don't necessarily even need to start a startup. You could just talk to someone or pitch this to someone, but you have to get out of your comfort zone. And the academic conferences you go to, you need to go to a networking event in the aviation industry, and that's scary, right? And so yeah, there's often these barriers between disciplines that I find very, very sad. I actually really like going to business or random industry networking events, because this is where connections can get made that can make the biggest changes. It's not in the industry specific conferences, because everyone's talking about the same technical stuff that, of course, they're making progress and making innovations. But then if you go to these, if you're the only machine learning expert in a room full of aviation experts, you can do so much. You can really spark all these little sparks. And after that, you're going to have people reducing emissions of flights.
Interested to hear more about this thought process that you have behind what motivates you personally in your work in AI machine learning, and that revolves around meaning.
Yeah, there's this concept that my mom read about in some magazine ages ago when I was a kid. It's called ikigai, and it's a Japanese concept, and it's how to find the reason or the meaning of life. It's kind of how to find your place in the universe. And it was you need to find something that has these 4 elements. If it was what you love doing, what you're good at, what the world needs, and then what can be a career. It's kind of I was always who cares about careers? But she was always no, because even if you really love doing this, but you can't get paid for it, then it's hard life as well. And so she always asked me this when I was picking my courses at university, or even my degree. She'd always be okay, well, is that aligned with things you love and things you're good at? And some things she'd be yeah, but okay, you're not really good at that though. I mean, you could really want to do this, but maybe this is not what you're good at. And so I think that it's always been kind of my driving vector in my career. And I feel that it really helps feel that you're useful, and you're a positive force in the world. And so, for example, when I was working at Morgan Stanley, I felt that really interesting problems, I was doing really well, no questions asked, the salary was amazing, no complaints there, but there was missing this what the world needs aspect that was kind of this kind of an itch I couldn't scratch, essentially. And so but given this framing, this ikigai, I was oh, that's what's missing in my life. And so I think that, I mean, people in general, not only in machine learning, it's good to think about not only what you're good at, but also what you love doing and what motivates you, and why you would get out of bed in the morning. And of course, having this aspect of what the world needs. And it doesn't have to be solving world hunger. It can be on a much smaller scale, or on a much more conceptual scale. For example, what I feel that what we're doing at Hugging Face is really the world needs, machine learning needs more open source code, more model sharing, but not because it's going to solve any one particular problem, because it's going to contribute to a large, a spectrum of problems, anything from reproducibility to compatibility to products to, right? But there's this, the world needs this to some extent. And so I think that really helped me converge on Hugging Face as being maybe the world doesn't necessarily need better social networks, or because a lot of people doing AI research in the context of social media, or these big tech companies. But maybe the world doesn't necessarily need that. Maybe not right now. Maybe what the world needs is something different, right? And so this kind of four-part framing really helped me find meaning in my I guess my career and my life in general, trying to find all these four elements.
I love that. And I'm curious, what other examples or applications do you find and see potential meaning in AI and machine learning?
I think that an often overlooked aspect is like accessibility and I guess democratization, but like making AI easier for non-specialists, because like, can you imagine if, I don't know, anyone like a journalist or a doctor or anyone, right? Like any profession you can think of could like easily train or use an AI model, but like from their point of view, because I feel like, yeah, for sure we do AI in medicine and healthcare, right? But it's from a very AI machine learning angle. But if we had more like doctors who were empowered to create more tools, or but like any profession, like a baker, like I actually have a friend who has a bakery here in Montreal, and he was like, yeah, well, can AI help me like make a better bread? And I was like, probably, yeah. Like, I'm sure that if you did some kind of like experimentation, and like, he's like, oh, I can install a camera in my like oven, and I was like, well, yeah, you could do that, I guess. I mean, like we were talking about it, and actually bread is pretty fickle. You need like the right humidity and and it actually takes a lot of experimentation and a lot of like know-how from boulanger in French. And so like, oh, same thing for croissants. His croissants are so good. And he's like, yeah, well, you need to really know the right butter, the right blah, blah, blah. Anyway, and he was like, I want to do like an AI model that will help me bake bread. And I was like, I don't even know how to help you start. Like, where do you start doing that, right? And so like accessibility is such an important part. And like, for example, the internet has become so accessible nowadays, right? Like anyone can navigate. Initially it was a lot less so. So I think that AI still has some road to travel in order to become a more accessible and democratic tool.
Yeah, absolutely. And you've talked before too about like the power of data and how it's not talked about enough. And I think of what you just mentioned, like with the bread stuff or the medical field, or the coral reefs that we were chatting about before. The amount of accessible data, or just even talking about how to attain that, could be so valuable.
Once, like 4 or 5 years ago, we went to Costa Rica with my husband on a trip, and we ended up like, we were just looking on a map, and then I found this like research center that was like at the edge of the world. It was like in the middle of nowhere. We had to take like car on a dirt road, then a first boat, then a second boat to get there. And they're in the middle of the jungle, and they essentially study the jungle. And they have all these like camera traps that are essentially like automatically activated cameras that are like all over the jungle. And then like every couple of days, they have to hike from camera to camera to switch out the SD cards, and then they take these SD cards back to the station, and then they have a laptop, and they have to go through every picture it took. And of course, there's a lot of false positives because of like wind or whatever, like a really animal moving fast, and they have like there's literally maybe like 5% of actual good images. And I was like, why aren't they using AI to track biodiversity? And then they like note like, oh, we saw a jaguar on blah 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 at this like station. I mean, at this like location, because they have like a bunch of them. And then they would try to track of like, if a jaguar or another animal got killed, if it had babies, if it looked injured, like all of these different things. And then I was like, I'm sure a part of that could be automated, at least like the filtering process of like taking out the images that are essentially not useful. But they had graduate students or whatever doing it. But still, like, there's so many examples like this, like in all domains and all areas, and just having these little tools. I'm not saying like, because I think we're not there yet at completely replacing scientists in this kind of task, but just like small components that are really annoying and like really time consuming, then machine learning can really help bridge that gap.
Yeah, absolutely. Oh, that's so interesting that they're.
It's actually really, camera trap data is a really huge part of tracking biodiversity, and it's used in like for birds, it's used for animals, it's used in a lot of cases. And actually now it's picking up. There's a Kaggle competitions for the last couple of years around camera trap data, and essentially like during the year they have camera traps in different, like especially like Kenya has a bunch, and like Tanzania as well. And then at the end of the year they have this big Kaggle competition of essentially recognizing different species of animals, and then after that they deploy the models and then they update them every year essentially. So it's starting, it's picking up, but there's just a lot of data. As you said, there's so much, and then essentially each ecosystem is unique, and so you need a model that's going to be trained on exactly, like, you can't take a model from Kenya and make it work in Costa Rica. That's not going to work. So you need data, you need like experts to train the model. So there's a lot of elements that need to converge in order for you to be able to do this so far. But can you imagine if there was really like kind of like auto train? Hugging Face has auto train, but even simpler, where like a biodiversity researcher in Costa Rica could be like, these are my images, like help me figure out which ones are good quality and like the types of animals that are on them, and they could just like drag and drop the images and like a web UI or something, and then they had this model that's like, here are the 12 images of jaguars, this one is injured, this one has a baby, blah blah blah.
Exactly. Oh my gosh, that's so cool. The other thing that that has to do with data is there might be, I'm curious to if you have insights around teams that are trying to accomplish things with machine learning but just lack the necessary data. And are there sources or tips or information that you have in regards to those
I think I guess another anecdote. I have a lot of these anecdotes. At some point, we wanted to organize an AI for social good hackathon here in Montreal. This was like 3 or 4 years ago. And then we were like, we're going to contact all these NGOs, like soup kitchens, homeless shelters in Montreal. We're going to like do good. And we started going to these places, and then we're like, okay, where's your data? And they're like, what data? I'm like, well, don't you keep track of like how many people you have in your homeless shelter, or like if they come back? And they're like, no. And then they're like, but on the other hand, we have these problems of either people disappearing and we don't know where they are, or people staying for a long time, and then at a certain point we're supposed to like not let them stay. Like they had a lot of issues, or like for example in food kitchen, they had a lot of wasted food because they had trouble predicting how many people would arrive, and sometimes they're like, yeah, we noticed that in October usually there's less people, but we don't really have any data to support that. Anyway, so we completely canceled the hackathon, and then instead we did I think we called them data literacy or digital literacy workshops. So essentially we went to these places, I mean, if they were interested, and we gave kind of like 1 or 2 hour workshops about, how to use a spreadsheet and like figure out what they wanted to track. Because sometimes they didn't even know what kind of things they wanted to save, or they wanted to really have a trace of. And so we did these, I think like we did a couple of them in some places. Like we would come back every couple of months and like check in. And then a year later, we had a couple, like especially a food kitchen. They actually like we managed to make a connection between them and like I don't remember what the company name was anymore, but they essentially did like this supply chain management software thing. And so the soup kitchen was actually able to like implement a system where they would track, like we got 100 or like whatever 10 pounds of tomatoes and blah 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 and blah blah blah. This many people showed up today, and this is the wasted food we have. And a year later, we were able to do a hackathon to help them reduce food waste. And that was really cool because we really saw like a year and some before, they had no trace of anything. They just had intuitions, which were useful but weren't like formal. And then like a year later, we were able to actually get data and then like integrate it into their app, and then they would have a thing saying, oh, be careful, your tomatoes are going to go bad soon because it's been 3 days since you had them. And then in cases where it's like pasta, it would be like whatever, like 6 months or a year. And so we implemented the system that would actually like give alerts to them when, and it was like super simple in terms of technology. There was not even much AI in there, but just something that would like help them keep track of different categories of food. And so it was a really interesting experience because I realized that, you can come in and be like, we're going to help you do whatever. But if you don't have any data, like, what are you going to do?
Yeah, exactly. Oh, that's so interesting. That's so amazing though that you were able to jump in there and just even provide like that first step, the educational piece of that puzzle to get them set up on something like that.
Yeah, I really like, I mean, it's been a while since I organized any hackathons, but I think these like community involvement events are really important because they help people learn stuff like we learned, that you can't just like barge in and use AI, that you really need to, like, digital literacy is so much more important. And sometimes they don't even have, like, they just never really put the effort into collecting the data, even if they needed it, or they didn't know what could be done and things like that. So, taking a step or 5 steps back and helping, improve tech skills, generally speaking, is a really useful contribution that people don't really realize is an option, I guess.
Yeah. Very cool. What industries are you most excited to see machine learning be applied to?
Climate change. Yeah, environment is like kind of my number one. Education's always been something that I've like really been interested in, and I've kind of always been waiting. Like I did my PhD in education and AI, like how AI can be used in education. I keep on waiting for it to like finally hit a certain peak, but it's kind of, I guess there's a lot of contextual elements and stuff like that, but like I think AI in education, machine learning in education can be used in so many different ways, from like helping people. For example, what I was working on during my PhD was like how to help pick activities, like learning activities and exercises that are best suited for learners, instead of like giving all kids or adults or whatever the same exercise, to help them like focus on their weak knowledge points and weak skills and focusing on those. So instead of like a one size fits all approach, and like not and really like not replacing the teacher, but like tutoring more, like the actual, like, okay, you learn a concept in school, for example, and help you work on it. And if someone figured this one out really fast, they don't need those exercises, but someone else can need more time to practice. And I think that there's so much that can be done, but I still don't see it really being used. But I think it's potentially really impactful.
Very cool. All right, so we're going to dive into rapid fire questions. And even though they're rapid fire, if you want to expand on any, feel free. But I think this is a super fun part, just to get kind of a larger perspective of yours in terms of machine learning. Some other weird questions. But so if you could go back and do one thing differently at the start of your machine learning career, what would it be?
I would spend more time focusing on math. So as I said, my two parents are mathematicians, and they would like always give me like extra math exercises, and they would always be like, math is universal, math. And so, when you get force-fed things in your childhood, you don't necessarily appreciate them later. And so I was like, no, languages. And so I kind of really like, for a good part of my university studies, I was like, no math, no, only like humanities. And so I feel like if I had been a bit more open from the beginning and kind of realized the potential of math, even in linguistics, even in like a lot of things, I think I would have, come to where I'm at much faster than spending like 3 years being like, no math, no math. I remember like in grade 12, in my final year of high school, like my parents made me sign up for a math competition, like an Olympiad, and then I won it. And then I remember I had a medal, and I put it on my mom, and I'm like, now leave me alone. I'm not going to do any more math in my life. And she was like, yeah. And then after that, when I was picking my PhD program, she's like, oh, I see there's math classes, eh? Because you're doing machine learning, eh? And I was like, no. But yeah, I should have gotten over my initial distaste for math a lot quicker.
That's so funny. That's interesting to hear that, because I often too will hear people say, oh, you need to know less and less math, the more advanced some of these libraries and programs
definitely get. But I think having a good base, I'm not saying you have to be like a super genius, but having like this intuition, like when I was working with Joshua, for example, he's like a total math genius, and like just the facility of like interpreting results or understanding behaviors of a machine learning model, just because the math is so like second nature. Whereas for me, I have to be like, okay, so I'm going to write this equation with the loss function. I'm going to try to understand what the consequences, blah, blah, blah. Right. And it's just like, it's a bit less automatic, but it's a skill that you can develop. It's not necessarily based on theoretical. It could be also like experimental knowledge. But just having like this really solid math background helps you like get there quicker. I think you can really kind of like skip a few steps.
That is brilliant. And you've got the best
parents. Oh my god, no, I refuse to ask my parents for help. No way. Plus, since they're like theoretical mathematicians, they think machine learning is just like for people who aren't good at math and who are lazy or whatever. And so it's like, there's like all this, depending on whatever area you're in, there's the pure mathematicians, like theoretical mathematicians, there's applied mathematicians, there's like statisticians, there's data, like there's all these different camps. And so I remember like my little brother also was like thinking of going to machine learning, and my dad was like, no, stay in theoretical math. That's where all like the geniuses. I don't know. I remember how he put it. He was like, no, like machine learning is where like math goes to die. I was like, Dad, I'm here. And he was like, well, I'd rather your brother stayed in something more refined. And I was like, that's not fair. So yeah, there's definitely this like, well, because like there is a lot of empirical like aspects in machine learning. There's a lot of trial and error. Like you're tuning hyperparameters and you don't really know why. And so I think formal mathematicians, unless there's like a formula, they don't think it's real. They don't think it's legit.
That is so funny. So besides maybe a mathematical foundation, what advice would you give to someone looking to get into machine learning?
I think getting your hands dirty and like starting out with I don't know, Jupyter notebooks or coding exercises, things like that. So especially if you do have specific angles or problems you want to get into, or just ideas in general, like starting to try. Like I remember the first, like I did a summer school of machine learning when I was like in the beginning of my PhD, I think. And then it was really interesting, but then it was like all these examples, like they were so disconnected from, like, I don't remember what the data was, like cats versus dogs. I don't know. It was like, yeah, but like, why am I going to use that? Like, and then they're like, part of the exercise was like, find something that you want to use, like a classifier essentially, to do. And then I remember I got like, I don't know, pictures of flowers or something, and I got super into it. I was like, yeah, see, it like confuses this flower and that flower because they're kind of similar. I understand. I need more images. Like I got super into it, and that's when it clicked in my head. Like it's not only this like super abstract classification, or like, oh yeah, I remember we were using this data set called MNIST, which is super popular because it's like handwritten digits, and they're really small, and it's like the network goes fast, so people use it a lot in the beginning of like machine learning courses. And I was like, who cares? Like I don't want to classify digits, like whatever, right? And then when they let us pick our own images, all of a sudden it gets a lot more personal and interesting and captivating. So I think that if people are like kind of stuck in a rut, they can really focus on things that interest them. And even like, for example, related to climate change, get some climate change data and start playing around with it. And it really makes the process more pleasant.
I love that. Find something that you're interested in and almost like
Exactly, yeah. And like one of my favorite projects I worked on was classifying butterflies. We trained neural networks to classify butterflies based on like pictures people took, and it was like so much fun. It was just like, it's like you learn so much, and then you're also like solving a problem that you understand why, like how it's going to be used. And so it was such a great thing to be involved in. And like I wish that everyone had found this like kind of interest in the work they do, because you really feel that it's like, yeah, you're making a difference, and it's cool and it's fun and it's interesting, and you want to do more. And like, for example, I mean, just tangent, but this project was done in partnership with the Montreal Insectarium, which is like a museum for insects. And I kept in touch with a lot of these people, and then they just renovated the Insectarium, and they're opening it after like 3 years of renovation this weekend. And they like invited me and my family to the opening, and I'm like so excited to go there. And to, like, you can actually like handle insects. They're gonna have stick bugs. They're gonna have a big greenhouse where there's butterflies everywhere. And in that greenhouse, like, I mean, you have to install the app, but you can take pictures of butterflies, and then it uses our AI network to identify them. And I'm like so excited to go there and to use the app, and to like, and to see my kids using it, and to like see this whole thing. Because like before like the old version, they would give you like this little pamphlet and with pictures of butterflies, and you have to go find them. And then I just can't wait to see the difference between like that like static representation and this like actual app that you could use to take pictures of butterflies.
Oh my gosh. And how cool to see something that you created
Exactly.
being used
And even
like
if it's
that.
not like, fighting climate change, but it's like, I think it can make a big difference into like helping people appreciate nature and biodiversity, and like taking things from something that's like so abstract and like two-dimensional and kind of like whatever, yeah, pictures of butterflies, to like something that you can really like get involved in and take pictures. Like I think that makes a huge difference in terms of like our perception and our like our connection, right? It helps you make a connection between yourself and nature, for example.
Oh, I think that's so beautiful. I'm so excited.
Can't wait.
Oh, that's very cool. Let's see. Oh, should people be afraid of AI taking over the world?
I think that we're really far from it. I guess it depends on what you mean by taking over the world, but I think that we should be a lot more mindful of what's going on right now instead of kind of thinking to the future and being like, oh, Terminator, whatever. To kind of be aware of how AI is being used in our phones and our lives, and to be more cognizant of that. And technology and general events in general, we have more influence on them than we think, right? By I don't know, by using Alexa, we are giving money, or any kind of tool, not Alexa in particular, but like Alexa or Siri or whatever. We're giving agency. We're giving not only like material funds to to this technology, and we can also participate into it. Like, for example, oh, well, I'm going to opt out of my data being used for whatever if I am using this technology, right? Oh, I'm going to read the fine print and figure out like what it is that AI is doing in this case, right? And being more involved in general. So I think that people are really like seeing AI as like a very distant kind of potential mega threat, but it's actually a current threat, but on a different scale. So it's like a different perception. It's like, instead of thinking of like this like AGI or whatever, start thinking about the small things in our lives that AI is being used for, and then engage with them. And then it's going to make it more, there's going to be less chance that AGI is going to take over the world if, you make the more mindful choices about data sharing, about consent, about, I don't know, using technology in certain ways. Like, if you find out that for example, your police force in your city is using a facial recognition technology, you can speak up about that. That's part of your rights as a citizen in many places, right? And so it's like by engaging yourself, you actually have you can have an influence on the future by engaging in the present.
Good answer. I like that. That makes me feel better too. What are you interested in right now? It could be anything. It could be a movie, a recipe, a podcast.
So during the pandemic, like the lockdowns and stuff like that, I got super into plants. I bought so many plants, and then now we're preparing a garden with my children. So we actually planted. This is the first time I've done this. We planted seeds for like tomatoes and peppers and cucumbers. I usually just like buy them at the grocery store or wherever when they're already ready. But this time around, I was like, no, I want to teach my kids, but I also want to learn myself what the whole process is. And so we planted them like maybe 10 days ago, and they're starting to grow, and we're like watering them every day. And I think that like this is kind of also like part of this process of like learning more about nature and the conditions that like you can help plants thrive and stuff like that. So we're really like last summer already we built like just a square essentially that we filled in with dirt, but this year we're trying to make it better. I want to have like several levels and stuff like that. So I'm really looking forward to to learning more about like growing your own food.
That is so cool. I feel like that's such a grounding hobby.
Yeah, and it's so like it's like the polar opposite of what I do. Like it's great to like not do something on my computer, but just like go outside and have like dirty fingernails and like and I remember like being so like, who would want to do gardening? It's so boring. And now I'm like super into gardening. I'm like, I can't wait till the weekend to go garden.
Yeah. Oh, that's great. There is something so rewarding about creating something that you can see, touch, feel, smell, as opposed to pushing pixels.
Yeah, exactly. It's like a different, like sometimes you spend a whole day like grappling with this program that has bugs in it and it's not working. You're like so frustrating, and then you go outside and you're like, but I have cherry tomatoes. It's all good.
I'm gonna go deal with these other bugs. Awesome. What are some of your favorite machine learning papers?
My favorite, I think, currently like papers. by a researcher or by Abeba Burhan, who's a researcher in like AI ethics, and she writes. It's like a completely different way of looking at things. So, for example, she wrote a paper that just got accepted to FACT, which is like a fairness and ethics conference in AI. It was about like values and how the way we do machine learning research is actually driven by like the things that we value and the things that, you know, for example, if I value a network that has high accuracy, for example, performance, I might be less willing to, for example, like focus on efficiency. So for example, I'll train a model for a really, really long time just because I want it to be really accurate. Or like if I want to have something new, like this like novelty value, I'm not going to like read the literature and see what people have been doing for whatever 10 years. I'm going to be like, I'm going to reinvent this. And so she has this really interesting, I mean, her and her co-authors read this really interesting paper about, you know, the connection between values that are kind of like theoretical, like kind of metaphysical, and the way that they're instantiated in machine learning. And I found that was really interesting because typically we don't see it that way. Typically it's like, oh, well, we have to establish state of the art. We have to, I don't know, whatever, establish accuracy and do this and that and that. And then like site related work, but just like kind of, it's just like this thing, like it's like a checkbox, right? You just have to do it. And then they think a lot more in depth about like why we're doing this. And then what are some alternative ways of doing things that, you know, for example, doing a trade-off between efficiency and accuracy. Like if you have a model that's slightly less accurate, but that's a lot more efficient and trains faster, that could be like a good like way of democratizing AI because people need less computational resources to train a model, right? And so there's like all these different connections that they make that I find it really cool.
Wow. We'll definitely be linking to that paper as well, so people can check that out. Yeah, very cool. Anything else you'd like to share? Maybe things you're working on or that you would like people to know about?
Yeah, something I'm working on outside of big science is on evaluation and how we evaluate models. We'll kind of link to what Abeba talks about in her paper, but like even from just a pure machine learning perspective, what are the different ways that we can evaluate models and, you know, compare them on different aspects, I guess, not only accuracy but efficiency and like carbon emissions and things like that. So there's a project that's kind of started for a month or so now of like how to evaluate it in a way that's not only like performance driven, but that takes into account different aspects essentially. And I think that this has been a really overlooked aspect of machine learning. Like people typically just, once again, just check off like, oh, we have to evaluate this and that and that, and then submit our paper. But there's also these interesting trade-offs that we could be doing and things that we could be measuring that we're not. And so, and looking, for example, if you have a data set and you have like an average accuracy, is the accuracy the same again in different subsets of the data set? Like are there, for example, patterns that you can pick up on that will help you improve your model, but also make it more fair? Like, I mean, I guess the typical example is like, you know, image recognition, does it do the same in different, well, I mean, like the famous gender shades paper about like, you know, the algorithm did better on white men than African American women, but like you could do that about anything, not only gender and race, but you could do that about like, I don't know, for example, for images like color or types of objects or angles, like, you know, is it good for images from above or images from street level? Like there's all these different ways of analyzing accuracy or performance that we haven't really looked at because it's typically more time consuming, right? And so we want to make tools to help people delve deeper into the results and understand their models better.
That's brilliant. Very cool. And where can people find you online?
I'm on Twitter, Sasha_MTL, and yeah, that's about it. I have a website. I don't update it enough, but Twitter I think is the best.
Perfect. We can link to that too. Sasha, thank you so much for joining me today. This has been so insightful and amazing. I really appreciate it. Thank you for listening to this episode of Machine Learning Experts. If you or someone you know is interested in direct access to leading machine learning experts like Sasha, who are ready to help accelerate your machine learning roadmap, please visit hf.co/support to learn more. And we'll see you next time. Thanks.